Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people who I've connected with in the world of arts and entertainment over the years, and today we are doing another segment of our new series, Guitar Talk, and I'm so glad to have back with us Brain Gagnon. Welcome back, Brian.
Thanks. Good to be back.
Yeah, good to be anywhere these days, right?
It is.
Yeah. So we've spoken before about your career, and there's a little bit of a different slant on this series. As you know, it's all about guitars and playing guitar and all things guitar. Now, I know that you didn't start on the guitar. You've had quite the illustrious career, most famously with the band The Hunt, I guess, and you've played with some top shelf people, including Shania Twain, and we were just talking about Mike Tilka and Frank Soda, etc. But you started out on the piano when you were 6 years old, and from what I understand, it wasn't until 10 years later that you picked up the guitar. Is that right?
That's about right, yeah. My father played piano and guitar, and he also played trumpet and various other instruments. So he had a guitar laying around. And my younger brother wanted to learn how to play guitar, so I said, well, I'll teach you. But I didn't know how to play it myself, so I bought a chord book and stayed one lesson ahead of him and used my father's guitar. It was an old Harmony acoustic guitar. And just from there, the interest in guitar was a little more than, like you said, I was playing piano, but I found that the guitar was a little more into the music I was into. So I stuck with it for a while.
That would have been in the early 60s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Beatlemania and all that, and then the Rolling Stones and all the guitar bands. That was a new thing then. I mean, it's crazy that when you think about the evolution of guitar for a while, like in the 40s and early 50s, it was lap steel that was the thing, and the ukulele, and the guitar really took a back seat in the early days, and then all of a sudden, like I guess from the late 50s and especially in the early 60s, everybody wanted to play guitar.
Yeah, well, I think that was a Les Paul thing. What he did is ended up getting it electrified so you could actually hear it in a band. So once you could hear it, then they started making it one of the main instruments.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look back at some of the old vintage videos of orchestras, like in the early 50s, there would be somebody on like a jumbo acoustic guitar in the back, and you could barely hear them. And they would often have a mic on it, but back in those days, amplification wasn't nearly as developed as what it is today. So the guitar was really kind of a backseat instrument in those days.
Yeah, it was just part of the rhythm section. There was usually a stand-up bass, which wasn't electrified either. And then a drummer who played with brushes. And your rhythm section was that acoustic guitar, bass, and drums.
Right, yeah.
But the main part of the orchestra was the horns and, so on.
And the piano was often up front. Now, so at 16 years old, who really caught your ear or your eye that really inspired you to get into it? Was it the obvious? The Beatles, or was there somebody else or something else?
Well, it started with the Beatles. When I first saw the Beatles, I said to myself, which a lot of people did, I want to do that. And, they were all playing guitars, so I thought that was pretty cool. But I was more into the heavier music back then, like the Kinks, All Day and All the Night, and songs like that, where the guitar was really, pushing the song. That was my main influence, the Kinks and bands like that.
And they were really pushing the envelope. It was almost like garage band punk sort of precursor, I guess, and...
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and the Kinks really did go through a strange evolution too, because I remember right around the time that The Hunt was making waves, the Kinks was really doing some different stuff. There was a, what was it, Paranoid Destroyer?
Yeah,
that was totally unexpected for me, but they were really innovative, and I guess the Beatles caught almost everybody's eye, but it's interesting to see, when artists had other outside the box influences that, like the Kinks kind of made it big, but not nearly, they didn't affect nearly as many millions as what bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones did.
Yeah. The reason I liked the Kinks so much back then is because the guitar was a more driving sound, and that ended up being, my first love in music was basically a heavier guitar sound. Rumor has it that guitar on the Kinks song, if it was so driving, was actually Jimmy Page playing that. I read that somewhere, and I don't know if the person that wrote it was, it was factual or not, but that's what I heard.
Well, it's interesting, going back to the early 60s, how many artists didn't get credit for what they played and how many acts got credit for things that they didn't do. You think about the Beach Boys and the Monkees,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't be surprised at all if that was Jimmy Page. What I was going to say about the Kinks is that their rhythm was really chunky and heavy, where you compare that to the Beatles, for example, or even the early Rolling Stones. The Beatles had a lot softer, more melodic guitar approach in the early days. And
yeah, they were song oriented. They relied on just a strong song and great vocals. But at the same time, if you listen to the early records, all there is two guitars, bass, and drums on there. On their early stuff,
right?
Which was fascinating that they could do so much with a song with just those four instruments. Of course, drums too.
Well, their producer kind of helped, I think.
I'm sure.
A lot of help with the arrangements and actually help with playing as well, I think. I don't think they had quite the library of chord structures and so on before they met Mr. Martin.
No, I believe that's true, because if you watch some of their movies where they're playing live, they're not spectacular musicians. They're just really good songwriters.
Yeah, and I've heard from some reliable sources that a lot of the Beatles' success was the crew that was around them. They had a lot of people, a lot of really smart people around them at the time. Yeah, now back to the Kinks and other similar kind of garage band, guitar-based bands from the day. I'm also wondering, was Peter Townsend much of an influence on you then?
He was, although not quite as much as some of the guys that played solos. Peter Townsend was more of a rhythm guitar player. He didn't do a lot of solo stuff. I would have liked to heard more solo stuff on the earlier stuff.
I'm just reminded of, I kind of compare in my mind the Kinks to the Who, the way the rhythms went.
Yeah, the Who always had really strong rhythms and strong guitar, for sure.
Yeah, now you mentioned that the first guitar that you played was your dad's old Harmony. What about the first guitar that you actually owned? Do you remember what that was?
After I played my dad's guitar for about 6 months, I started learning songs, and I wanted to start a band with some friends who also played a little bit. So I said to my dad, I want to buy a Fender Stratocaster. There's one in the store downtown for $4.99. That's what they cost back then. And he said, well, you get half the money up and I'll pay for the other half. So I ended up getting a paper route, delivered papers, and saved my money, and ended up getting enough to so the Stratocaster was my first guitar, the Fender.
Really? Very nice. Was that one of the Sunburst models, or?
It was the Sunburst. It was brand new right off the wall back in, in the 60s at some time. It was a beautiful guitar. I wish I still had it. It'd be worth a fortune.
Yeah, no kidding. Now, do you remember, was that like the first one you picked up off the wall, or did you try any other Strats before you settled on that one?
No, that's the first one I picked up, and I really liked it. And the action was really low, which is something I really like. I don't like high action. And it was really easy to play compared to my father's acoustic guitar.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
So I thought this is going to be a lot of fun. So I saved my money and got half the money up, and my dad gave me the other half. And we went down to the store. This is in St. Catharines, and bought the guitar right off the wall. Nice.
Yeah, I haven't been able to pick a Stratocaster off the wall and get everything I wanted. I found that the more recent models, or even within the last 30 years in my memory, I usually find one that plays great and doesn't sound great, or one that sounds fantastic but doesn't play great. So that's why I've had a couple of Fender-style guitars custom built for me over the last few years, because I haven't had the same kind of luck as you have just picking one off the wall that works for me. But I do think that the earlier models were overall better for quality control.
They were, yeah.
Pre-CBS.
Later on, I guess about 4 or 5 years after that, I started getting into how to setting up guitars. So I could find one that, the action wasn't what I liked, but it sounded good. And I could set it up. I could straighten the neck and lower the action and do the intonation and stuff like that.
That's interesting because I just recently had a conversation with Bernie Labarge.
Right.
And we were talking about how both of us are afraid to do our own setups. And in particular, I know a lot of guys don't really like the notion of turning the truss rod. I know it's not that big a deal, but it's kind of cool, that you can do all that stuff and you have no qualms about it, because it certainly saves a lot of trouble and aggravation, being able to do it for yourself.
Yeah, I've always set my own guitars up. I had a Fender bass at one time, a Precision, that I couldn't get the action low as I wanted, so I took the neck off and put a shim under where the neck goes on and put the neck back on, and it was perfect. So,
wow.
I'm not afraid to play around with them.
Yeah, it sounds like, yeah. Boy, oh boy, I just had a situation where my Solocaster, a custom-built Strat, so I think it was to do with the humidity. I picked it up one day and the action was really high near the neck pickup, and
right.
I really didn't know what to do. Yeah, I lowered the bridge as much as I could lower it, and then I took the gamble and I turned the truss rod, even though I was afraid I might crack the neck or whatever, and that didn't happen, but the action was still too high. So then I took the neck off, like big step into deep water for me. Took the neck off, and then my wife walked in the room and she went, "Oh my God, did you break your guitar?" And I said, "No, I didn't break it yet." And then when I put the neck back on, for whatever reason, the action had corrected itself. So I don't even know how that happened.
Yeah, it could have just needed a slight move. That's the thing I like about Strats, that you can take the neck off and shim it or do whatever you need to do. Whereas some guitars, like the Les Paul, which is a great guitar, obviously, but you can't really take the neck off and do a lot of adjustments on it.
No, you really can't take the neck off of any Gibson that I'm aware of.
You have to rely on the truss rod. But no, I got into, filing the nut. I did buy a Les Paul at one time, and the action was a little high, and I couldn't get it to go down without buzzing, so I ended up filing the nut down a bit, and it worked out perfectly. And again, it was all experimentation, but I wasn't afraid to try it.
Now, did you ever have an experiment go bad?
No. I've been really lucky.
That's a boring answer.
Yeah, it is. No, I take my time, and I think it out logically before I touch anything on it.
Yeah, well, you're one of those guys, that kind of a Renaissance man from what I gather, and you're not afraid to try a lot of different things. Like, from what I understand, your job really is as a multi-instrumentalist in the studio. And are you still doing the same thing like you were at the last studio, where you work with solo artists and basically become their band on record?
Yeah, that's about 90% of my work, because, in the studio business, you can advertise all you want, but it's mainly word of mouth, and people come in and I'll do that for them, and then their songwriting friends, "Oh, where'd you get that done?" And then they come to me. That's about 90% of my work. The other 10% is working with people, with full bands, and so I'm recording drums.
Right. Now, we should tell people you're at a new studio. What's the name of the new studio?
It's called Seven Valley Recording. It's at Highway 7 in Pine Valley.
In Toronto?
Just North Toronto, yeah.
Okay. 7 and Pine Valley. Okay.
Yeah.
Quick editor's note, 7valley.ca is where you'll find all the information that you would ever need to know about 7 Valley Recording Studios. That's 7, like the number 7, valley.ca. Now back to the show.
It's a little bigger studio than where I was, and it's a little nicer appointment.
Right.
Just done up a little better. And the guys that own the studio, two brothers and another fellow, they're in a band called Roller Coaster Jupiter. And we've just started work on their new album. They're a really good band. And they're really nice guys. So it's great to work there.
Are these younger guys?
No, they're in their late 30s, I'd say.
Well, compared to us, they're younger guys.
Compared to me, they're kids, yeah. But they're excellent people and excellent musicians. It's really good to work there because they're such nice guys.
Cool. Now, you like I said, you're a multi-instrumentalist, so you've also done a lot of work as a bass player. Did you kind of pick that up simultaneous, or was it like an evolution from the guitar into the bass for you?
Well, what happened is when I lived in St. Catharines, as you know from St. Catharines, there was a lot of good musicians came out of there. And there was 5 or 6 really good bands in St. Catharines. And I saw this one band, and they needed a bass player. And because I was a lead singer, that was, I could fill a couple of gaps in that band. So I basically said to them, look, I play bass, but I'm also a lead singer. And I hadn't played bass before, but being into music, all your musician people that are listening will know, you know what the bass player should be doing if you're a guitar player, and you know what the guitar player should be doing if you're a bass player, etc. So I knew what the bass should be like in a band, and these guys were incredible musicians. Glenn Grotto was playing drums, and Paul Dickinson was playing guitar, and Bob Morrison played keyboard. So they were all fabulous musicians, and I knew what the bass should do in the songs, the original songs. We did a lot of Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin as well. Of course, you can get the bass right off the records for those.
Right.
So I switched, because that band needed a bass player and lead singer, I sort of said, well, I can fill those 2 holes for you. So I started immediately, I went out and got a Fender Precision bass and an Ampeg bass amp and started immediately playing bass at the first rehearsal, and it worked out really well. And I really enjoyed it because it was a whole different way of looking at the song.
Yeah, no kidding. And to start out with a Precision and an Ampeg rig, you weren't fooling around.
No, I knew the sound I wanted, and I'd seen various bands play, and guys that had a Precision with the SVT amp always had this great sound, so that's the sound I wanted to get.
Right, and so you just went for it. Now,
Yeah.
I'm curious, back to the guitar for a minute. You've mentioned that you like lower action. Do you use a heavier or lighter gauge strings?
I make life easy on myself. I use 9, and I have real low action. For a while, I was using 8 on the guitar, which is even thinner. But I just found them to be a little lacking in the tone that I was looking for, so I went up to 9. So I try to make life as easy as possible for me.
I was going to set my Solocaster up going down from 10 gauge to 9 to 42, but I backed out of that decision. I kind of thought that I'd like to make it a little bit easier on myself, but I find just by switching guitars, I can keep things interesting that way.
Yeah, I just found, like Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top uses 8s on his guitar. And he said, I use 8s because I want to make life easy for myself.
And he gets a really fat sound, so that's just crazy.
Yeah, the way he sets his amp, he puts very little treble on it. It's mainly mid-range. So he gets a great sound.
Well, that would explain it. And I guess that's partly why he gets away with so many pinch harmonics, too, with the lighter gauge strings.
Yeah, that's a whole technique that I really like. That technique is being able to pinch the notes to get those harmonics coming out when you're playing a solo and so on.
Now, do you ever use the pointer finger and thumb pinch harmonic technique?
The odd time. I'm not really one of those speed demons on my solos. I'm more of a melodic guy.
I hear you, yeah.
I came from listening to a lot of Eric Clapton and people like that when it came to guitar.
Mm-hmm. And from my knowledge of the stuff that you've played on, you definitely play for the song, and I think that's what everybody in the band should do.
That's exactly right. I'm always saying to people who come into the studio, the young bands, some of them really aren't ready to record because they're just doing their solo thing through the songs instead of listening to what the singer's doing and leaving space for things and so on. It's really important to play to the song. Yeah, you're right.
Now, I wonder, do you think that some of these young guys coming in have the preconceived notion that they want to be all over the place and that's the sound they're looking for? Or do you think that they're pleasantly surprised when you give them some decent production advice?
The majority of young guys like the idea that the person behind the mixing board has done it before. You know, they're musicians as well, and they will listen to advice. But some of them go, no, that's my sound. And it gets a little frustrating for me sometimes when they say that's my sound, but it's stepping all over the singer and, you know.
Are you able to like put the blinders on when you get that sort of obstinance from a player or players? Like, can you just kind of muscle your way through the session, or does that just not happen?
What I do is I try to have a lot of patience because, number one, I'm not always right. They might come up with a new sound that, has never been done before, and it works really well. So I'm not a cut and dry type of guy. I have a lot of patience for people who want to, try their own sound and see how it works.
It just made me think of what would the world have become if somebody said to the Beatles, you can't all sing lead vocals.
Exactly.
You've got to pick one guy. And it was just George, or just Paul.
Yeah. Well, the thing with music and musicians and bands is it's an art form, so it's really subjective. And I remember I was doing this seminar with a panel of different songwriters. It was called Date with a Tape. And people would bring in their tapes and you would sort of critique it. And they basically didn't want me to come in anymore because I was too positive. One girl started her song off with the chorus. So one guy in the panel, I won't mention any names, very famous songwriter in Canada, said, you can't start the song with a chorus. So I looked at him and I went, she loves you, yeah, yeah. And so they didn't want me back because I was being too positive. I was saying, you can start the song with a chorus. If it's a good chorus and catches people, then that's what you want to do.
You could probably rhyme off 10 other Beatles songs right away that started out with the chorus too.
Yeah. I can name 100 songs that start with a chorus.
Yeah.
Or the theme of the chorus. So this guy who's a very famous songwriter, that was his opinion, but he's not always right either. So.
Well, there's a radio guy whose name I won't mention who told me that he wouldn't play any of my songs that started with a drum fill. He says, don't you know that songs have to have a good intro? And sometimes,
Yeah.
You mentioned She Loves You by the Beatles, one of their first big hits, and it starts with a big drum roll before it goes into She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I found, to be a little blunt, I found that most radio guys don't really know what they're talking about because they don't play. If they played in a band and they understood music and they wrote music, they would be a little more open to trying new things.
I guess so, yeah. So back to the guitar for a minute. Do you have a favorite guitar amp?
I've used various guitar amps. The last amp I used was a 50-watt Marshall with a 412 cabinet, and it just seemed to have the all-around sound that I needed. I'm a real Strat guy. I like Strats, but I don't like the noise that goes with Strats. So what I end up doing is getting the noiseless pickups. The Strat that I currently use in the studio has hot rails, single coil hot rails, which aren't really single coil. And it still sounds quite a bit like a Strat, plays like a Strat, but there's no noise involved in it. So,
right. I have the white parchment noiseless pickups. They're actually Fender stock.
They're very good pickups. I like those. I've tried those before.
I like them too, but they're not exactly noiseless. They're quieter than previous Strat pickups I've had.
Yeah. Well, I put compression on a guitar when I'm recording it, and that adds a bit of noise too. But if you know how to handle the guitar and how to handle the volume pedal or the volume control, you can eliminate a lot of that noise.
Yeah.
Like in between when you're not playing, your guitar's turned down.
I have found that with my Solocaster that it is a lot less noisy with the volume slightly turned down. Yeah. And it just, I'm one of these guys that for years, I had my volume way down while I was playing rhythm, and then I would crank it up to 10 for solos. Kind of hard for me to break away from that mold, but
that's a good mold to be in because those are the dynamics you need. With if you're using a tube amp and you play it quietly, it cleans it right up. And then you turn it up and it gives you a little bit of overdrive and saturation from the tubes. And that's actually a good habit to have.
Speaking of good habits, if I were a young person, teenager, just wanting to get started playing guitar, what advice would you give to me as far as getting started?
In sound or actual playing?
In, I guess, all around basic advice for somebody just starting out on guitar.
Well, just starting out on guitar is to learn the basics, and be able to find your way around the guitar, knowing the basic chords and some of the scales and so on. And then listen to people that you like and try to learn what they've play. 'Cause that's going to be your biggest influence, is being able to, copy other people. Not that you want to end up copying other people in the end, but you'll end up with your own style. But just learning off records and figuring out how these people get that feeling in their sound. Your fingers and the strings can actually talk. It can actually make different sounds, the way you pick them, the way you finger them, the vibrato you may put on it, and so on. So I would just say learn the basics and then start trying to learn off records.
I think that's really good advice. That's how I started out, and a lot of my peers and guys like you started out learning to play by ear. And I learned a lot from watching TV. Like I used to watch the Ed Sullivan Show and the Tommy Hunter Show and so on, and I'd kind of learn things.
Yeah, we all watch those, yeah.
Yeah, I learned things from watching guitar players on TV. That said, although I think that learning stuff from guitar players on TV when I was a kid was a really good way to start out, in fact, I believe I did learn a lot more overall by putting the needle back and forth on the record and trying to train my ear that way, like you say. And I find that a lot of kids today are focused really on YouTube, which isn't bad advice either, I don't think. And I've had a couple of my guests on this Guitar Talk series suggest that people really get into YouTube. But I think
there's some good people on YouTube.
Yeah, but I think if you learn everything visually, then that's going to maybe hinder your ability to train your ear. And then with a trained ear, come up with your own melodies and so on.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to sound harsh about it, but I'm of the feeling that you've got it or you don't got it. In other words, if you're a musical person and you hear music in your head and you can hear somebody play and understand what they're doing to make that sound, then you've got it. Then you can really develop and learn how to play guitar. But some people just aren't musical and they just do everything by, paint by numbers. And they'll never have it. I think you got it or you don't got it. You're born with it or you're not.
I think you're right. And it makes me think back to when I was a kid and some of the older guys that I used to look up to because, they could cop Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and Pink Floyd and stuff while I was still struggling with early Beatles and Stampeders and stuff. But then somewhere along the line, they just dropped the guitar. And I have a feeling that maybe some of these guys were just doing it for the cool factor or whatever without really, as you say, they didn't really have it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a firm believer in that. You've got it or you don't got it. And that's something you're born with. It's something that's in you. And if you got it, you can develop it, further by learning.
Now, Brian, are you a pedals guy when it comes to guitar?
No, the only pedals I used when I played live and in the studio is basically a compressor and maybe a chorus pedal for some of the effects and a little delay perhaps on the solos. And that's it. These guys that use 15 pedals and come into the studio, they just create a lot of noise on their system. And they end up just playing an overdrive sound with, two distortions. When if they had a good tube amp, they could get the same sound without the noise.
I get you, yeah. I have pedals on my pedal board that I only have there really because my live act is usually a 3-piece.
Yes. So you got to have a variance, yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I do a lot of twin lead parts in studio. So to kind of help replicate that live, I have a Boss Harmonist pedal, so I can set that so I can reproduce on stage what I did in studio. But I don't have a lot. So you would say the compressor, delay, and chorus are your 3 top picks for pedals.
I bought this little Dynacomp compressor once to try on guitar, and I never played after that without it. And it's not an expensive one. It just evens out the sound and gives you this attack that I really like.
Editor's note, the Dynacomp compressor that Brian is talking about is still available, the MXR Dynacomp compressor, under the Jim Dunlop banner, and it's widely available online. And now back to the show.
And then I found out later on Pete Townsend uses the same compressor, and David Gilmour has that compressor on his board. And if you look at any of these big guitar players and you look at their rig, there's always a compressor on the guitar.
I read something the other day that said David Gilmour used 3 compressors stacked.
Yeah, I saw the same thing. He does. What that does is that gives him a studio sound on stage. I remember when we used to play live, in a group called Rumble Seat. We were a tribute to John Cougar, and I played guitar in that band. And every time we played, there was a different sound man, a different system. And the sound man would always say to me, I don't have to do anything to your guitar. It already sounds produced. It already sounds like it's coming off a record. And I said, yeah, that's the compressor, and that's just, the style of playing. But the compressor to me is such an important factor in keeping the guitar nice and even and so on. And there's some people who will just totally disagree, and they can't play with the compressor because it seems the compressor sound too much for their liking. But those are usually people that play too loud.
I get you. Yeah, I get you. And I was never a pedals guy for years and years. I was reluctant to get into any pedals. I think at one point I had a Jim Dunlop Crybaby on stage, and that was my one pedal. For a while in the 80s, I had a chorus pedal and a digital delay. And that was really only at the behest of the band.
Right.
I'd never felt comfortable. I mean, you listen to all that 80s Police, in the late 70s Police, and Andy Summers, the guitar player, have I got that right?
Yep.
Yeah. His stuff was so heavily chorused, and it makes my ears want to bleed,
Yeah. It's a sound that you either really like or don't like it. I tend to like it in a lot of ways because he obviously had a compressor going at the same time, so it was fairly even sounding. But yeah, he had a lot of force.
Well, I say that, and then I think about Every Breath You Take, and I actually really like that sound.
Yeah.
Or Walking on the Moon.
Yeah, he was an interesting guitar player.
So I take it back, Andy Summers. You don't make my ears want to bleed.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Do you have a preferred go-to brand of strings?
No, I use all the normal ones, the Dario and whatever. I'm a cheap guy, so I just look at the prices. I think most of the strings are made, there's only like 3 different factories in North America that make strings, so they're all pretty much the same anyway.
Yeah, for a while I was on this GHS Boomer kick. And if I couldn't,
I use those.
If I couldn't find those in the store, I'd go somewhere else. And then I think it was only within the last 10 or 15 years that my favorite music store in London stopped carrying those. And so I said, what do you recommend? And they said, well, these are the cheaper ones, and they were the Dario.
Yeah.
And there was really no difference that I could tell from the Boomers to the Darios at all.
No, there's such a little difference in strings. You can get different brands. You get the same gauge, the same material that they're made of. They're probably made in the same factory anyway.
Well, a few years ago, I picked up a set of these SIT, Stay in Tune strings.
Right.
And I was going to have my tech use them to do a setup on, I don't even remember which one of my guitars it was. But he looked at me and he said, I won't put those things on your guitar. And I said, okay, I trust you. But now I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any difference.
There's not a whole lot of difference, in my opinion, anyway.
Cool. So we've pretty much nailed most of the things that people want to know about guitar coming from you and me today. So I don't want to take up a whole lot more of your time, Brian. And I'll just say thanks so much once again for doing this with me. And until next time, cheers.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Tommy.
Likewise. Brain Gagnon is not only a true gentleman and a pleasure to talk with anytime I have the chance, he is also a consummate musician, and you really should check out sevenvalley.ca if you're an artist who wants to get recorded and get the best possible help in the Toronto GTA area. Now, this just out of the bag. Brian and I have been discussing doing a small recording project together, and we will keep you posted on that in the not-too-distant future. Now here, without further ado, is A Song for a New Day by The Hunt, featuring Brain Gagnon on lead vocals and guitar. Enjoy.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including guest acquisition, recording, editing, and so on. And hey, if you like the show, why not subscribe and help support us through Patreon at patreon.com/TommySolo. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a clip from my original composition, The Burn. All rights reserved. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks for listening, and until next time, cheers.